on traceability, transparency, and accountability in your supply chain. I am super excited that you all have joined us here today for this amazing panel hosted by Zephyr Consulting. I'm going to turn it over to Dave Kelly, the principal at Zephyr Consulting, and he's going to introduce you to our amazing panelist lineup today and give you a little bit of orientation as to what we're going to cover today.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for coming. This is our first web-based roundtable, so I'm going to apologize in advance for any technical issues we might experience. My partners Annette and Jessica are going to be working behind the scenes to make it all work out. As Jessica said, my name is Dave Kelly. I'm the founder and principal for Zephyr Consulting, LLC. It's a group of highly experienced practitioners that are committed to improving supply chains in the footwear and apparel industry, whether for brands or for factories or material or service suppliers, both through advisory and supply chain as a service offerings. So again, we're really glad you could join us today. The fact that you're here tells me you're not living under a rock. You're seeing the news, the articles around traceability, the lack of definition and direction or cohesion between the various players and stakeholders. And you're trying to figure out how to get ahead of this because you know it's a huge and important shift. We've got some experts with us today. They're going to help us to do just that. But before we get there, just a little bit of housekeeping. We are going to have a few polls, one in the beginning here, and Annette, you can go ahead and put that one up, one in the middle and one at the end. Please make sure to fill those in as we go through the hour, as they're going to inform our panelists and help us to understand you and what you're looking for as customers of the event. So Annette, if you can flash that up. Other housekeeping, please put any questions in the Q&A box, and importantly, also include who specifically you're asking the question to, or if it's to the whole group of panelists, let us know that as well. And that'll help us to get it to the right person. And then lastly, we are going to be recording this and sending out the follow-ups afterwards, just so you're aware. All right. So let me welcome and thank our incredible panelists, all of whom I'm fortunate to be able to call friends as well as colleagues, and really just an incredible set of individuals. Jeff Gauss is the founder and CEO of a software company named the Provenance Chain Network, located in Portland, Oregon. They are committed to bringing transparency to commerce and providing consumers the truth about where their products come from and who made them. Dr. Henrietta Lake is the director and founder of Lake Advisory, located in London, and has been actively advising and delivering value to a number of key footwear and apparel brands globally for decades. Her work is at both the boardroom level, but also in supply chain facilities around the world on the ground. And then finally, my friend Simon Haskell, a global business leader that has driven transformative change at major footwear and apparel companies around the world. While he started in the commercial end of footwear and apparel business, merchandising, retail, operations, product management, his scope and reach is truly cross-organizational, and his passion is really guiding our industry to be better stewards of the globe. So welcome, guys. Thank you all for making the time to be with us today. Annette, can we take a look at the results of that first poll?
Sure, and we still have folks coming in and adding their comments on here. So you might see these bars change a little bit, but our first question is really about understanding from our attendees where you're at on the journey. So what level of awareness you have. And it looks like we've got a fair amount right around the middle. So, my thoughts here are many people are talking about traceability and just starting to figure out what does it mean to them, developing a plan. So that's kind of that middle section is really talking about a plan and a strategy. And on either side of that, I think looks like people are here to learn and to find out what more they can do. So the vast majority of people are in that building awareness stage into starting to put a plan together and perhaps even implementing some actions within their company. So I think this is going to be a great panel to learn more.
Excellent. Thanks, Annette.
Sure.
So let's dive into it and get our panelists going. Why is traceability so important right now? That's the question we want to start with, and I'm gonna send it over to Simon. Simon, what are the trends we're seeing from a consumer perspective in this space around traceability?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I think, we can all sort of Google the trends in terms of percentages, and there's a lot to say that there's a massive amount of intent there from especially Gen Z and late millennials to purchase from brands that can provide some level of transparency. Depending on which poll you look at, it's sort of in the 70th percentile. So very strong intent. I guess, not a scientific poll, but, something I observe every day is just my daughter. She's 15. She's in that sweet spot. She's seeking out the truth. She's very big on, I guess she wants to save the planet. This generation feels like it's their responsibility. And I think, I can't understate the seriousness that she takes it. She's on the internet every day. She's seeking things out. She's trying to get the truth. She's trying to get to the brands that are doing the right thing. And I think it's very difficult. And I think it sort of talks to, I guess, where everybody's at on this journey. We're sort of in the middle. We're trying to work it out. So I look at it, I suppose the overarching trend and the theme would be there's serious intent there, I think, from the consumer to seek out brands are doing the right thing. Okay. Yeah. The challenge is, how do I make those choices without substantive claims? So there's a lot of noise, and a lot of times it sort of, I guess we see it ends up being a premium. So you might have to pay a carbon offset, or you might have to buy a credit or something, you know what I mean? It sort of becomes economic, but is that really going to do anything? Are we just going to plant a tree? We're going to spend some money and we're going to plant a tree. So I think we're in this muddy, messy middle ground. We're all trying to work it out. Consumers confused, a lot of noise. And I think, I guess through the conversation today, I think we'll get closer to, how do we provide some sort of substantive evidence to provide the consumer, an easier choice or information to make an informed choice. So
awesome. Thanks, Simon. So, it's interesting as you talk about evidence and confusion. Henry, I would love to hear where you're at, what you're seeing in the regulatory changes that are impacting brands and factories at the country, at the state level. What are those regulations? Is there more clarity there, or is there still a little bit of confusion?
There is emerging clarity, but it is literally happening right now. So as you will all know from being on this call, so I'm not, you have some basic knowledge, otherwise you wouldn't be here already. As you know, there is activity happening in the US and the EU. New legislation or updates to existing legislation. And the difference is that it's now being enforced either right now or coming really soon. And the fixes are not quick. So we're in this messy middle. The governments and the legislators are also feeling and finding their way. There are a lot of rumors going around that, the legislation is unreasonable, it's not going to work, how are we going to implement this, which is, I think, why everyone is here today. So, and also just to answer your question initially about why it's important to businesses because it is having a tangible impact right now on bottom line. Product is being impounded. Businesses are potentially going out of business. They're not being able to get product to different markets, and they can see that in the future, this is going to become tougher. So what we're looking at, because I think a lot of people would have done some legislation, so done some reading on the legislation. So let's just simplify. So we're going from, it's the evolution of lots, like lots of areas we've had, or I think about bribery and other sorts of areas. We're going from an area where it's been all sort of voluntary. Lots of companies have sort of rushed to talk about all these good things that they're doing to mitigate, stop risk and stop harms in their supply chain. But now what's happening is that there's mandatory requirements to understand what's happening in your supply chain and show that you are trying to do, that you are mitigating harms and remediating where there are harms. And the other big difference is that these laws are now being enforced. And I think the US has already customs has, with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, they've seized about $1 billion worth of goods. So what we're seeing is in Europe was actually, in some ways, you could argue, sort of leading in some of this area. There's some overarching European legislation on environment and social claims. And then different countries are responding, like Germany, the Netherlands, France. The labeling laws in France are getting a lot of attention now. So there's that overarching legislation that's coming and everyone's preparing for now. But then what everyone is talking about at the moment, and I'm going to direct my remarks to, is what's been happening in the US with customs, because there was an update to some legislation, new enforcement, and that's what's happening right now. And then in the US, what we're seeing is that's what's happening at sort of a federal national level. And then different states are also responding. So I think there's a lot of attention on the New York Fashion Sustainability Act, and I can answer questions about that later. And what it is now is that it's now about, you can't just say, hey, we're doing the right thing and it's all okay, look at these pretty reports and these good things we're doing. You actually have to show it. And so there's this big burden of evidence and proof and credible evidence. So the validity of those claims, the quality of that evidence is what is going to become really important. And to finish, I will just say that I know this is going to sound really boring and obvious, but it's all about, to summarize, it's all about trying to de-risk your supply chain. And you do that by understanding your supply chain, knowing where stuff comes from, and then building and maintaining trust with your supply chain partners so that you can gather information from them, and the information goes both ways, and so that you can work collaboratively to maintain this trust that the consumers that Simon's talking about are looking for. Now, I know that sounds simple, but it is not, because that is not, I don't need to tell you, that's not how supply chains work right now. And I think that's what we're going to unpack today.
Yeah, that's awesome. A couple things that I pulled out of that, Henry. First of all, the term emerging clarity, while coupled with enforcement at the same time, is a really scary kind of proposition, right? And then the second piece was credible evidence, and who defines what is credible evidence, and how do we all align and come to that. And so I'm actually going to shift over to Jeff and say, why is now the tipping point in the technology space, and what are some of the tools to think about to create this kind of digital traceability solution?
Well, I think the tipping point is a combination of some of the things that are mentioned here. I think there's three major trends that are driving this. Number one is this distrust of institutions. You just think about why Bitcoin was created, is because the world has lost faith in central banks. And we also see the loss of trust in brands and media, et cetera. The second is this environmental, or what I would call consciousness within our consumer community. People are very aware that their actions have impact in other parts of the world. And then third, and you don't hear too many people talking about it much, is we're going through a period of rapid deglobalization. And it's being driven by a whole lot of things, and that is, the energy markets, the geopolitical environment, labor forces, changing demographics. And as that unfolds, we're going to completely reconfigure our supply chains. And as that happens, people want to know what's going on. So from a technology perspective, you take into account things such as distributed ledger or blockchain technology, near field communications, 5G, machine learning, vision systems, et cetera. You can start to aggregate all of this data. And, Henry was talking a lot about credible evidence. And there was a pretty famous statement made by an American politician that said there is no truth. There's evidence of the truth. And if you think about the common law system or the United States' legal system, there's always the proof beyond a reason or evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. There's no absolute proof. It's just evidence of it. And so you ask the question about, what's the credible level of evidence and who decides? This is something we've spent a lot of time on. We're actually creating what we believe is the fourth category of enterprise software, which we say is a system of evidence, where you gather data and you present that data, and you can check on the veracity of the data, where it's coming from, et cetera, and provide that to the viewer. And the reason that matters is the days of plausible deniability are over, where a tier one supplier can say, hey, well, this is what I was told. That doesn't fly anymore. You're going to be responsible for things all the way back to its source. And so if you're a major brand, the reputational risk of this attempt at plausible deniability is massive. And McKinsey came out with a study in January that said something on the order of 93% of the companies on this planet have zero visibility of their supply chain beyond their tier one suppliers. So think about that. If you have a 7-tier supply chain and you've only got visibility to tier one, yet you're going to be held responsible for those other 6 tiers, you got some work to do, and you've also got some major exposure. So there's all kinds of technologies out there, but the bigger thing that is, in our experience, is the hindrance is the fear of sharing data. And so it's a cultural thing more than anything else, and it's a corporate culture, and it's a sense of distrust, et cetera. And the way I talk about it is, it's just like trust, or transparency is just like friendship. To have good friends, you must be a good friend. And so to have transparency, you must be transparent, which means you have to share data with people further down the supply chain.
That's interesting. And I want to ping what you said at the beginning, Jeff, around the distrust of institutions. And Simon, maybe you can collate that into, what you've said about your daughter or other consumers. Are you seeing that level of distrust, and is there a way for that generation to really begin to trust?
Yeah, I think there's enough data out there to say that there's a lack of distrust. I mean, I think, it's like 32% of millennials, Gen Z don't trust any piece of personalization that's coming to them, so that's one data point. I mean, you just scan the internet and you can see it time and time again. But again, sort of grounded in the behaviors of my young adults, my 15 and 18-year-old, they don't trust this generation. And I don't think there's any reason for them to do so, because I think there's too many examples of where, be it big business, big government, banking, etc. Trust is built on a delivery of a promise, and how many promises have been broken. If we look at plastic recycling, we can turn on the TV today and it will be Pepsi saying, hey, put this bottle in and it'll come out as another bottle. Well, it doesn't exactly work like that. I mean, we lived through the tobacco industry and the truth finally coming out, but that took a long time. But I think if you look at the magnitude of the promises that have been delivered through these young adults, this new consumer, they're just very cynical, very cynical. So I think you're coming from a place of cynicism, a place of mistrust, and I think to build that trust back, you need to really work harder. I mean, we all know, like I used to have this argument with my son, who's a very intelligent individual, and it was always like, what is the most valuable thing in the world? And he'd always argue that it was copper, because copper was going to be the piece that was going to connect all the technology. And I'd say, I believe it's trust. And so we'd have this debate, but I think you can see it more and more is that trust, the thing about trust is once you lose it, it's really hard to get it back, almost impossible.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of those things in life where we all know as individuals that once you lose that, it's hard to get back. You know, we're all in relationships, and back to sort of Jeff's point, you know, this transparency, this trust, you know, how we all operate. You know, I think, you know, many of us are sort of in the latter decades of our careers, and I think, you know, I was on a call the other day, and someone said, you know, it was like, why would we trust you? And I was like, well, because I wouldn't be able to operate if there wasn't trust. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, it's just an operating principle, personally, professionally, that we have to change. And then picking up on Jeff's point as well around, you know, the ability to share, you know, sort of put your cards on the table. You know, I guess most of us grew up in a world where, you know, it was sort of the poker game, you know, don't show your hand, don't show your hand, and then try to outbeat the rest. You know, now we're in a situation where it's like shared, you know, shared values, shared outcomes, we all win. But there's still the world that we came from, the traditional world, which was, don't give anybody your secrets, don't tell anybody, you know. So I think, yeah, it's a fundamental cultural shift that we're talking about, and I think it'll take some time, because we know culture takes time. More, you know, technology can be fast, but culture takes more time. So.
But Henry, you know, this, as Jeff said, this fear of data sharing. What's the government take on that? How do public institutions address that? Because I think they're real fears, right? Real concerns, but
they're very real. The government doesn't care about that. They're just go ahead, like you're talking about trust and sharing and dating, you know, going to relate it with consumers. And I'm thinking about it and talking to people about it between buyers and supplier, whether you're manufacturing garments for a big brand in the US, but then you're still got your suppliers. It sort of works both ways. And I think this is why I was saying it sounds simple. It's about trust and building relationships. But that takes time, and that's really hard. And I think that there are a lot of people right now going, right, let's respond to this. Let's like gather all the information and just as much as we can, and let's map everything. And people are running around chasing their tail. And actually, it's like, whoa, slow down. You can't do everything. You cannot map everything, at least not yet. And that actually wouldn't necessarily be a good use of resources. It's actually about relationship building at the moment. And we have to break it down, because suppliers, wherever you are, you've got some suppliers in the supply chain. They are being asked for information, but and we hear quite often the answer is, oh, I don't have that. We don't collect it in that way. I'm not sure. And it's not necessarily that they don't, it's that they don't understand, there isn't enough trust yet. And I keep hearing this again and again. So it's about trust building. It's also about really understanding your suppliers, and you can't, and it's like your whole supply chain, it's the proverbial mountain or elephant, right? You can't tackle it all at once. We have to break it down, and we have to segment. And you have to, I know that there's a debate at the moment about risk-based approaches, but really there is no other practical way to address this. We have to kind of break it down. What are the sorts of, where is their greatest risk? What sorts of suppliers that we have that we think are the riskiest? Let's start to try to engage them. It's like Jeff was saying as well, it goes both ways. This is relationship building. This is about incentives for suppliers to share information, thinking about where you've got realistic leverage to get that information, and working on it over time. And really also, because there is so much confusion, suppliers have been reticent to give information because they're not really understanding how it's going to be used, exactly what it is you're looking for. And I think that there is still, you know, a lot of confusion around that. And then there's a confusion about what sort of evidence. Jeff has spoken about this too, and I know Simon has views. You know, in my area of work, which focuses on labor, there are a lot of social audits, and the government, you're saying what levels of acceptability for government? The government, US government, knows that actually audits, it's a lot of activity, but that is some of the least trustworthy forms of evidence. And they're looking for different forms of evidence. Everyone goes, oh, the solution, just audit everything, just map everything, audit everything. Not at all. So I think it's about stepping back and thinking much more strategically about what is it we're trying to collect? What's the actual definition of that? Is everyone agreed? What's the use case? And then a step-by-step approach and being really clear. And then that relationship building, because it is cultural. Yeah. And, you know, I remember, I'm old enough to remember where it was like, oh no, we're not even going to tell you tier one. And now that's accepted that you need to tier one. And now we've got to go much further back. So it's breaking it down.
Yeah. You know, Henry, that I'm working with a supplier out of Asia right now that is asking its upstream suppliers for information. And the first question they're getting is, why? Why do you need that? Who's asking you for it? What's the purpose? So that whole trust and relationship building echoes, you know.
And it's this give and take that we've talked about. It's not, you know, it's the way social audits in my field haven't worked very well in the past. It's not like, you know, give us this or, you know, it's, we need to explain. It's like, we need a much more nuanced relationship where we're giving information and receiving it and saying, look, we're in this together. If we want to get product, let's say right now, over the next year into the US, or if we want to sell product in France and, you know, and label that correct, you know, we need to work together. And I'm asking you for this information. I'm very precise, and this is why. Yeah. And here's very clear expectation, you know, a definition of that. So yeah, again, it goes back to building trust.
Jeff, any quick thoughts on that before we transition to the next piece?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that conversation. We've encountered this discussion about data sharing, and you know, within a particular industry sector, I won't say which one, there's this attitude of there's, you know, NFW, am I putting my data on your network? And there's this fear about the sharing of intellectual property because the people talk about this transparency that all my data is going to be out there. And the way that we define transparency is equal to your credentials plus your vantage point. Who are you? What are you allowed to see? And where are you looking at the data from? And there's enough cyber protections that you can protect any data from anybody that you really want to, but you could also then expose it to the appropriate person. And Henry was talking about this relationship between the buyer and the seller. And that is the one relationship that is completely recursive throughout the entire supply chain. And so we've focused on that and said, okay, what's going on there? And if you think about that buyer-seller relationship, the buyer makes some requirements to the seller saying, this is what I need, this is what I want. And then the seller makes some claims against those requirements. And those claims are, you know, I'm organic, there's no weaker cotton, et cetera. But to substantiate those claims, you need evidence. And so what is that evidence that comes forward? And so as we studied that, we looked all the way around the world and said, you know, at the end of the day, every buyer-seller transaction has at least one third-party observer. And in many cases, there's more observers to the transaction than there are participants in the transaction. So, you know, it's Customs and Border Patrol, it's trade, it's tax authority, et cetera. And so there's all kinds of disclosure requirements that drive the assemblage of the evidence. And so this is one of those where the regulatory environment is fantastic in terms of driving this need. And there's going to be an industry or a brand that is going to heft its weight around saying, this is the way we're going to do business moving forward. And the rest of the supply chain is going to have to get in line, or they're not going to do business. And right now, that in the United States, that's being driven by national security reasons, either for cyber or economic security reasons, but it's national security reasons. It's going to be pushed down onto the industry. This movement is inevitable. It's just, yeah. And so the question that everybody on this call needs to ask themselves is this going to happen to me, or is this going to happen because of me?
Yeah, great. All right, we're gonna shift a little bit. We've got another poll mid webinar here. And so Annette, if you would flash that up, we're really gonna ask questions about how actively is your company communicating its commitment to traceability? And while they're doing that, maybe just for a minute or two, Simon, you have any thoughts on what makes up a good corporate commitment to traceability, or how you would communicate that such a commitment? Anything?
This is probably one of the harder questions, and I guess, you know, looking at who's doing a good job. There's one brand that in the apparel and footwear industry that sort of always comes to mind. That's Patagonia, and I think it's hard to go past that. The thing that, you know, I was just looking at their website the other day, and there's a statement there that basically says, Earth is now our only shareholder. And it's just, to me, it's like, it's a deep commitment, unwavering commitment, and it's beyond, and it sort of touches on a lot of the sort of cultural and the real stuff, the people stuff that we're talking about. Is like, it's beyond, you know, what you have to do or legislation or what have you. It's just doing what is right. And I think that comes across strongly. And, you know, I know enough people that have worked there, and, you know, I hear from any business, good or bad, regardless of what they're saying corporately, you know, are they doing it? And I believe it's almost to the counter of their commercial aims. Yeah. So I see them as a very strong brand in that space. There's definitely, I think, you know, the pitfalls for any communication really are going to be that you're stretching your promises beyond your delivery. I think, you know, do the best you can and obviously address it, but don't promise more than you can deliver. I think that's setting expectations clearly is important.
Dave, can I pick up on some of the things that Simon said about Patagonia, et cetera? And as we were founding the PCN, we started in the food and beverage industry, and one of the people we were working with is a pretty prominent winemaker. And the statement that he made is very, very enlightening. His statement was, I'm not sure that the average consumer wants to know what I'm legally allowed to do to a bottle of wine before I sell it to them. However, if I'm doing something I'm afraid to tell a consumer about, I probably shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah. That's amazing. Annette, can you flash up those results?
Sure can. 1 second here. Okay, hopefully folks can see this, but we had just over half of our participants respond to this. And, you know, again, pretty even spread on the answers around what the attendees that are representing different companies are actually communicating, all the way from, you know, there isn't a commitment within their company at this time, nothing that's been discussed or communicated, all the way to about 30% of those who responded saying that there has been communication around their commitment to traceability externally, either to their partners or on their website, you know, and about almost 50% kind of in that middle zone. So, you know, in the process of developing that communication plan, both to their teams internally, as well as ensuring that it is part of their corporate strategy and goals that then would be externally communicated to partners. So a real even spread here in terms of where people are, again, on this journey. And I think this reflects what we saw in that first question as well, you know, as far as just knowledge of traceability and what it means. So this is well aligned in there.
Great. So let's pivot a little bit. You know, with any relatively new requirement and process, there are wrong turns, there's going to be dead ends, there's potholes in the journey. And so learning from others is a great way to avoid making some of those mistakes twice. Henry, what are the biggest risks you see out there for footwear and apparel brands in terms of traceability evidence?
You're on mute.
You're muted. There you go.
I got the thing. Yep. Thank you very much. Running around, one of the biggest risks is spending quite a lot of money on a productivity, on basically a productivity tool that, you know, some mapping software they think is going to solve everything. And then actually I've seen people like spending money on that and then not really knowing how to use that evidence. So I think my mistakes I'm making is just pause, breathe, and be strategic about it and thoughtful about it. I was going to say our dear friends Patagonia, I hope if they were here, I would say it. They are, I'm allowed to say, an existing client of mine, and they are fantastic. And they do, I think, you know, they're doing what they say, they put that commitment out there, and they're doing something. But I would say it's easier potentially easier for brands like that. They have a particularly unusual supply chain that is very concentrated, that they have worked hard and have very good quality relationships that they have invested time in. So we can take that lesson. So they are great, but it is not as easy for everybody else who has quite a lot more complexity. So I think the mistakes are asking for the wrong information, rushing out and just trying to gather information without thinking it through, not budgeting, just really doing the research to find out what's out there, what makes sense, what are the multiple uses, what's the actual budget. And I suppose also not being paralyzed into inaction by going, oh my goodness, it is, you know, we can't do any of this. I think also we talked about risk-based approach. And I think that the mistake that what I see people not doing that they should do is just stepping back again, thinking about the macro risks and different sources of information. So not being like, okay, we need to map and we'll get audits, because actually that's not going to get you through to what you need, say, for UFLPA. It's a different sort of evidence. So question, ask, step back, look at different sorts of information sources, go to experts, think about the quality of the information. And then I think it's also what we said earlier, it's not just like telling people, you know, just demanding, you know, keep knocking on the door. Thinking about if you're trying to extract information, like what you're going to give in return. And everyone in the field that I know is working on this right now and getting product through and helping people with strategies in a very practical way. They're saying it's all about prevention and supplier enablement, like giving them the training that they need, not just on the tools, but what exact information it is. You know, so it's being more thoughtful, stepping back, thinking about where you're going to make the investments. And some of the answers I've tried my best to answer some of the questions here, and I've been asked some general questions, but sometimes it depends. Some of the answers to sort of what you do and what you need to do depends on whether it's UFLPA, whether it's the European legislation, and there's slightly different requirements. So it's basically not a blanket approach. And so just having that strategy, being thoughtful, getting advice from experts, not believing everything that you read, and just stepping back and really to simplify and summarize, it's just start this process now, like starting to getting to know your supply chain, identifying the major risks. And you can always then iterate that and come back and change your mind and then look elsewhere. Start those conversations now, because it's going to take a long time to get all the information that you need. But don't just collect any old information. Just be thoughtful about what you're collecting, because I do see quite a bit of wasted resource at the moment.
Jeff, where are technology solutions falling short that you're seeing out there, and what are the things people should be looking for when trying to find software?
One of the biggest failures in the technology sector is the siloization or a proprietary nature of a lot of solutions. And it reminds me of the early 90s, and there's many people on the call that are too young to remember this, but in the early days of the internet, and local area network, we had a lot of different cases. There was IBM Token Ring, there was the 3Com, there was Ethernet, There was Banyan Vines, there was Apple Talk, et cetera, et cetera. And these were all islands of productivity that didn't communicate with each other. And then along came this technology that we now know as TCP/IP. It was an inferior technology to some of those other topologies, but it was most common denominator. And so I think the biggest thing that is missing right now is the standards by which the supply chain communicates, because there's not a common format and there's not a common set of requirements, et cetera. And in PCN, we're doing quite a bit of work in this arena, and we're coming at it from the national security perspective, because we think that this is going to be the driving force of how this comes into play. But as you start to, somebody asked a question about the shoelace and the shoe in Indonesia and all of that. And when we started on this journey, we were asked about this, can we do traceability of a product? And it was focused on the QR code on a pair of shoes, if you will. And as you start to think about that, the moment you open that box, that UPC code is no longer valid, because now the box is a product, the paper that's in the box is a product, the left shoe is a product, the right shoe is a product, the eyelets are a product, the shoelaces are a product, the uppers, the lowers, et cetera. And so it's probably not a good metaphor for these times, but it's like a Russian nesting doll. And so this, we think about conscious Kim in the grocery or in the retail environment that is interacting with a product. How far down does she want to drill? And she's probably not going to go double clicking down to find out about the shoelace. What she's interested in is this a good product for me based on my values? And so the way that we look at that is that the product is going to, Kim and the product are going to interact with each other. But what's really happening is Kim's digital twin is interacting with the digital twin of the product. And there's a smart contract data exchange there of Kim's going to release some information to the product manufacturer, and the product's going to release certain information to her based on some standards. Now we're a ways away from that. That's more than 2 years away, but it's fewer than 10. And so as you start to think about that, and we're now seeing all this chat GPT, and, first up, it's not going to end the world, but it's also not going to be this panacea for everything. But we're going to enter the day in the future where we have this concept of cobotics, which is I have an assistant that's with me, and it happens to be a digital assistant. It's going to learn a lot about me and how I interact, and it's going to start presenting things to me. Well, to be able to do that, we have to amass huge amounts of data from the supply chain. And the only way to do that is to collaborate with the supply chain. And this is one of those that transparency, traceability, provenance is a team sport. And it's going to take leadership from somebody or some brand in a position of influence to say, this is the way we're going to do business. And if you're not going to do business this way, you're not going to do business with us. It's kind of simple. So, being a technologist, there's always this tendency to say, well, this is going to solve everything. At the end of the day, technology is a tool for human beings to use to solve very specific problems. So Henry, to pick up on some of the things you're saying is, we recommend zoom out and take a hard look at why are we doing this? Not what we're going to do or how we're going to do it. Most people just run at it with, I want to put a QR code on, or I want to, grab this technology solution. And our first approach is stop. Why are you doing this? And in the case of, one of the large players we work with is we happen to do a lot of work in the national security arena. It has to do with the Space Force. And their why is really simple. They can't afford to lose a payload, period. And so they need to know about all the components that are coming up through the supply chain there. And that is, that's hitting the industrial supply base pretty hard. But it's inevitable. There's all kinds of rules on the books that by 2027, we have to be able to prove no China in our supply chain.
So Jeff, you're starting to go there, and I'm gonna pivot us. We got about 8 minutes before I want to go to Q&A for the attendees. But I want to start talking about what are the right first steps that we need to be taking. Jeff and Henry, you're going there, but I also want to ask Simon, some of this we're going to have to sell internally to stakeholders to make sure we get the ball rolling. So how do you think about telling a compelling story, either externally or internally, to get that momentum within your company?
Yeah. Well, I think internally depending on where you're at, you might be within a department, within a big organization, or you might be within a small organization. So all different scenarios with different audiences. I think you've got to understand who your audience is and, what's that compelling argument going to be? My train of thinking was one, when any decision is made, I always think about serving the consumer. Like number one, like, am I serving the consumer? So as we can hear, as we can see, there's enough evidence to say the consumer is demanding this. So like, how do we serve them? I think there's the second piece, and it's been sort of talked about, is this mitigating the risk. So you could come from a place of fear, like a place of, hey, if we don't do this, our brand may diminish overnight. We've seen how the wrong moves by the wrong person in fashion take a Yeezy, like overnight, off the map. You know what I mean? And that's not to do with necessarily transparency, but it's sort of the wrong move at the wrong time. And so I think the risk to brands have never been bigger. Generally, that there's more downside than there is upside. So I think you have to play on that. And then I think if you take a more sort of maybe towards the sort of consumer, is like, how do we take this as a positive opportunity to lead, to innovate, to show the way, to shine the light on something. So someone's going to do that. And when you go through the list of who's really doing that, it's a very short list today. So you could get on and you could be, be it small or big, do something meaningful. So that would be my thought. And then externally, I think a lot of times, and I think if you look at sustainability, one of the issues has been its inability to market itself. And it's too complicated for most people to get their heads around. I think, the sense of transparency morphing into traceability, and traceability almost being transparency 2.0, or, some simplistic way of articulating it, because it tends to be, it tends to come from the sort of what I would call the back end and the technology and the tools, and so how do we bring it to the front end and sort of, I suppose, translate that into layman's terms. Yeah. Make it simple. Yeah.
Henry, you answered this already, I think, in the Q&A, but I wanted to bring it out. It was on my list of questions as well. What should people be thinking about in terms of staying informed with all of the changes in this dynamic environment, all of the regulations and spins, and how would you recommend someone to stay abreast of all this?
I was going to use the cliche. What just came to mind. I'm loving all these phrases. So I'm thinking, that my colleagues are using on the panel, I think just the same. I'm going to do a really cheesy one. Forgive me. I'm going to say, like, keep calm and carry on. Very British thing we said in the war, which is, Jeff's going to allow me that. Is he? Good. So what would you do? It would be, so to make everyone feel better, the biggest brands, and I'm sure my colleagues will confirm, everyone is worried about this and nobody quite knows the answer, and everyone's kind of feeling their way, and some people are going to lose out, and you don't want to be one of those companies that does. So you want to get ahead of this, and you want to try to get information from wherever you can, but it is not just everywhere. So it's the usual thing about truth and the trust and your information sources. And back to Simon's 15-year-old daughter, where do you get the truth nowadays? Well, on the regulation, I have to say, I've been quietly surprised by some of the fact that some of the legal and public affairs teams at some of the large brands are also feeling their way. But if you don't have a big team like that and they're one of your customers, ask them. So try to go to the experts. And then, because this is such a burgeoning topic and there is not clarity, speak, do your research on who are good information sources. I didn't attend it myself, but I spoke to somebody who did. The American Importer-Exporter Association was running some really good sessions, very practical. And they had some people on a panel last week who really know this, have been doing it, and are very sensible. And then it just goes back to the things that actually, Jeff and Simon are saying, it's the collaboration, it's building the trust with your suppliers, looking at the detail. Simon's been talking about different communication strategies and being specific and not over-promising. And I'm on the supplier side, and with my academic background, I'm thinking, look at the definitions. We're asking for information. What kind of information? What do you mean? How are you going to use it? Ask questions, get specific. And I'm sorry, there are some questions here which are quite broad, like the shoelace one. And the problem is it's not absolutely straightforward. I can't say this is the gospel, this is the truth, go here. It's messy, and it's about you doing the research and just thinking, okay, this is our landscape, these are our customers, this is where we're operating in, getting some information from reputable sources, from customers, from other suppliers, and that, trade associations, and just keep on banging the door and just saying, yeah, we need this information. We want this. And then gradually starting to unpack it. But whatever happens, whichever way this goes, the way it was here, it's all just about understanding what's going on in your supply chain from a risk point of view, different sorts of risks, environmental, social, some other, and knowing it's, you're back to your old, UN guiding principles. Know, show, and then act. And that action is coming really soon. So it's not okay. So you've got to think about it, go to the right sources. But then you do need to start investing some money in getting to understand and start having those conversations.
Thanks, Henry. So I'm gonna shift a little bit to some of the questions, and Jeff, I'm gonna start with you. It's an interesting question. I get it from some of my students at the University of Oregon a lot. Brian asked the question, for SME and startups, what sources do they have to implement traceability programs? But I also want you maybe just to spin that a little bit, because the question I have around that, is it easier for a small company with a less complex supply chain to do this than a big complex company like a Nike? And what are your thoughts on that for a smaller company versus a bigger company?
Well, I'm going to give somewhat of a tongue-in-cheek answer, and that is, do you want to have a meeting or do you want to be transparent? And when you go to a large company, you have to have lots of meetings and everybody wants to get involved. And I think it boils down to the intentionality, and the intentionality starts in the CEO's office. Mm-hmm. How are we going to do business? And if you want a really good example of that, take a look at Johnson & Johnson and their credo and how they use that in their business dealings, et cetera. And I'm going to weave a couple things together here. So Annette, can you pop up my slide? Because Klaus in the questions asked about transparency versus traceability. And I want to give an illustration on this because we've got a very strong position on this. And Klaus made the comment about traceability is about chain of custody. And we agree with that. It's just here's where it is, et cetera, who's had possession of it. Transparency is a little bit more than that. It's giving you a lot more details of what's going on where. But provenance is a completely different monster, because now you're starting to disclose composition, who touched it, all of those things. And so there's a multi-step process that you can go through on how to get there. And it's pretty straightforward. Number one, you start with digitizing the supply chain, which means you no longer accept PDF attachments to an email message or go hunting for fax documents, et cetera. The only way you're going to accept data from anybody is in a digital format. And then you start making requirements and claims within that digital environment. Here's my list of my RFP, my request, and then their supplier starts to respond in a digital fashion, and they give evidence. And then you start to evaluate that evidence. I heard Henry talking a lot about audits, and audits are, in my opinion, a rear view mirror as opposed to the side mirrors or the windshield. And having inspections and audits and things like that get attached to the data elements as they're moving through the network becomes absolutely critical. And then the last step is you start to share that data. And so back to the question about the SME, if you think back to the early 2000s, if you wanted to have a customer relationship management environment, you had two choices. You either wrote a really big check to Oracle, SAP, Siebel, or whomever, or you hired a bunch of programmers and you developed your own thing. You didn't have any other choice. And around 2002, along comes this guy by the name of Mark Benioff, and he took an Oracle database, threw it in the cloud, and gave data connectivity to it. And he didn't go after Citicorp or JP Morgan or anything. He went after Jeff and Henry and Simon's little consulting practice with 3 seats. And that's now one of the dominant software players in the world because they started serving SMEs. And we believe that transparency is going to be table stakes at some point in time. Right now, it is a differentiator, but it will become table stakes. And so we've architected to serve the small player. And I actually think that in the near term, 3 to 5 years, the companies that decide that are a tier 2 or a tier 3 supplier that choose to be transparent are going to have a competitive advantage. And so I would encourage them to do everything they can to digitize their supply chain and start pushing data forward in the supply chain so that they have a competitive advantage. And you can probably tear this down and that, I mean, stop sharing.
Yeah.
So does that answer your question, Dave?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. And we're getting close to the end. We have one more poll that we want to put up there while we're answering maybe our last question and closing things down. So Annette, could you launch that poll? It's really about, you know, is this helpful? Would you be willing to attend another? What's your interest level on that? But as the group are answering that, Henry, I want to ask a question, and I just lost it. Where did it go? That was asked about working with suppliers. What are the best practices? What are they challenged with? If you were going out to help a tier 1 or a tier 2 supplier, what are their unique challenges, especially when they're serving multiple brand customers?
Sounds like a repeat of audits, exactly. Multiple customers, multiple demands, similar but slightly different and conflicting. So I think it's again about relationships and communication. And there are some dominant players, some names have already been mentioned on this call, who are saying, this is the technology that we want you to submit. This is the platform, the solution that we want you to use, submit everything here, otherwise we're not going to do it. Not everyone is going to be saying that. I think some first movers are going to do that. And then there will be some dominant solutions that will come to the fore because they've had the backing of those dominant players at the top of the chain, bottom, whichever way you look at it, getting closer to the consumer, selling to the consumer. Can I say, I don't think it's going to be one solution. To Jeff, I mean, Jeff may or may not agree. I know he's the specialist here, but I think, yeah, it's going to be a sort of amalgam of things. What would suppliers do? It's about, again, you know, it's about being thoughtful, asking questions, conflicting demands. I think it's opening up a conversation with, you know, with your customers about this. What exactly are they, I suppose it's starting with doing a poll. Who am I supplying? What are they asking? Bringing all that together, working out what the common, just logical, right? Like all the things that we've all been saying and not that surprising. If you step back and just take a moment, you're like, okay, we need to understand the market. What's being asked? What's the most pressing? We need to prioritize. We need to think about risks. Who's your most important customer? What are they asking for? Let's service them. Let's listen to that. And then let's go and talk to the others and see if they would also accept that. But whichever, that's in some ways is just kind of the icing. There's all this pre-work to do first, which is sort of your supply chain is your supply chain, and you are going to need to know more about it and understand where the bigger risks are. And you're almost certainly going to need to have different information sources at your fingertips and information than you have in the past. So it's thinking really carefully about that and setting that up now, because some of that may take months, if not years, to come into play and for you to be able to use that information. So I think it's about, you know, all the usual things. Don't stick your head in sand. Start having conversations now. Don't put this off. you can communicate, because if you're going to want to meet consumer expectations, like Simon's saying, you're going to need to start acting right now, which I know people know. So I think it's about, it's again, communication, trust, but figuring out who you most want to date. Going back to that dating analogy, who are you most aligned with? Whose expectations can you meet? Maybe you can't meet everyone's expectations. So just thinking really carefully about that now. And then I do think, because to answer the question you gave to Jeff, I actually think, and where Jeff went with it, I agree with. I think it's going to be easier for SMEs, potentially. They do not have the resources, but they've got some better quality relationships. I mean, go back to the Patagonia example and look at the size of their supply chain just at tier 1. Of course, it then gets big, but it's simpler to start with. And I think that they do have a competitive advantage, even though they haven't got that power and might. But if you're small, you've still, hopefully you've got to start investing in those relationships and getting that information exchange.
Yeah, if I could jump in here, I'm looking at the Q&A list that we have. A lot of the Q&A questions relate to how suppliers are engaged, tier 1, 2, 3. And the questions around both, what is the evidence needed, which I think has been addressed quite a bit, know your supply chain, dig down in, but also really looking at what is that relationship and ensuring that there are incentives to provide that information, that it is not, as Inka from Eileen Fisher noted, that it's not punitive, right? It's not a do this or we will drop you, but that we're really working in partnership with our supply chain to encourage them of what the benefits are by sharing information and the collaborative approach. That's what a lot of these questions relate to, is how do I work with my suppliers? What is that information that I need? And, I know we're running towards the end of the hour here, and maybe there is a way that we can summarize some of these questions in the Q&A and send that out with the recording afterwards with some answers.
Yeah, for sure. As always, the hour goes faster than we would have liked. I just want to, as I think about how do we summarize this, the phrase that keeps coming back is this emerging clarity, right? But that relationships and trust, and this is a team sport, is really the way we have to be thinking about moving forward. Understanding what is required before you start moving forward, before you start going down a wrong path. And then I liked what you said, Henry, know, show, and act, and start at the top. The CEO has to be involved. So there's gonna be more to come on this. We hope to see you all again. I can't thank you, Simon, Henry, Jeff, enough for spending your hour with us. Amazing. Thank you so much. We will share the recording and some of the next steps, as Annette said, but really any questions, any concerns, reach out to Zephyr Consulting. We've got a number of pilots underway in the industry, a number of relationships in place, and we're uniquely positioned to really help you get going down this path. So thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure. It went too fast, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.
Bye.